Hi everybody, and welcome to Love Fraud Live. You may have heard the rumor that sociopaths or psychopaths burn out as they get older. I looked at a textbook called The Little Black Book of Psychiatry. It says that by their mid-40s, sociopaths engage in less antisocial behavior and become either delightful raconteurs or miserable hypochondriacs. Is this true? I'm Donna Anderson, author of LOVEFRAUD.com and host of the True Love Fraud Stories podcast. For those of you who have watched in the past, I'm glad you're here, and for new viewers of our live show, welcome. Tonight, I'll explain exactly what happens as these disordered individuals get older. At the end of my short presentation, I'll answer your questions. So, let's get started. For years, the conventional wisdom in the mental health field was that psychopaths burn out or engage in less antisocial behavior after age 40. This is stated as fact in multiple psychiatry textbooks. But my research, published in a peer-reviewed journal in 2022, indicates that psychopaths do not burn out. A new scientific paper validates my conclusions. So why should you care? Because if you're dealing with someone who has psychopathic traits, chances are slim to none that this person will change for the better later in life. If you're seeing lies, manipulation, cruelty, and abuse, it will continue. If he or she is taking advantage of you or others, that will also continue. Before I go on, you may have noticed that I said both sociopath and psychopath, so let me explain. There is no longer a clinical diagnosis called sociopath. So Love Fraud uses the word sociopath as an umbrella term for all the personality disorders in which the affected individuals manipulate, and exploit others. These include antisocial, narcissistic, borderline, histrionic, and psychopathic personality disorders. I used the term psychopath in my published paper because it's the most common terminology used among psychopathy researchers. The psychopathic personality disorder is similar to, but not precisely the same as, antisocial personality disorder. Now, maybe you think that you don't need to worry about this because the person that you're dealing with is only a narcissist and not a psychopath. Well, psychopaths are also narcissistic, and many narcissists have psychopathic traits. So you should assume that the information in this video applies to you. And I'll explain more about this in detail in a few minutes. Anyway, my scientific paper is called Surviving Senior Psychopathy: Informant Reports of Deceit and Antisocial Behavior in Multiple Types of Relationships. It is based on data that I collected in Love Fraud's Senior Sociopath Survey. More than 2,000 Love Fraud readers answered questions about someone they knew who they believed was disordered and was age 50 or older. There's a link to my research in the window below this video. Here's the most important finding of my research. About half of the survey respondents knew the person both before and after the age of 50. Of them, 93% said the individual's deceit, manipulation, and antisocial behavior was just as bad or worse as they aged. The bottom line is, if you continue to engage with a disordered individual, this person will probably be disordered forever. In addition to the paper, I wrote an entire book with the data that I collected. It's right here. It's called Senior Sociopaths: How to Recognize and Escape Lifelong Abusers. It includes not only the statistical analyses, but also stories submitted by the survey respondents that will make your hair stand up. People in their 50s, 60s, and 70s are still quite capable of evil. My research was cited in a paper that reviewed personality data collected about a particular group of individuals 4 times over 10 years, starting when they were between the ages of 55 and 64, so they were seniors. This research also collected information from informants, people who knew the individuals being studied and could provide information about their personalities and behavior. This was exactly the same approach that I used in my paper. The research found that psychopathic traits remain almost perfectly stable on average across the time period in this period of their lifespan. So that means during their senior years. That's more proof that psychopaths continue their bad behavior as they age. Plus, the study noted that psychological and physical functioning declined as the years go by, but they didn't exactly clarify what that meant. Now, my book has plenty of examples of declining psychopathic behavior in old age. Essentially, psychopaths who once worried about maintaining a certain image stop caring. They no longer try to hide their nasty personalities. So for anyone around them or attempting to care for them, they simply became more mean and miserable. Okay, so here are my thoughts about narcissists. When I started LOVEFRAUD in 2005, there was limited information available about psychopaths and sociopaths and no discussion of narcissists. But then, over the years, suddenly everybody starts talking about narcissists. Nothing in particular instigated this change, it just kind of organically happened among online survivor groups. Now, in my opinion, people are using the term narcissist simply because it's not as scary as psychopath. Often, when someone tells me that they're involved with a narcissist and then describes the person's behavior, it sounds an awful lot like they're dealing with a psychopath. The LOVEFRAUD Senior Sociopath Survey included an assessment for psychopathic traits from the pre-publication first draft of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or DSM-5. Survey respondents were asked to rate the individuals on the traits of psychopathy. So here are the standard traits: callousness, aggression, manipulativeness, hostility, deceitfulness, narcissism, irresponsibility, recklessness, and finally, impulsivity. So those are the traits that we measured. In the LOVEFRAUD survey, 77% of the individuals scored high enough on those traits to meet the cut score for psychopathy. So to me, that means that even if the average LOVEFRAUD reader believes they're dealing with a narcissist, the person may in fact be a psychopath. Therefore, as you decide what to do about your involvement with the particular person, understand that you may be dealing with a psychopath or someone with psychopathic traits, and psychopathic behavior will not improve with age. So, that's my presentation for tonight. If you would like in-depth advice for your own situation, I do offer personal consultations. I can also help you with your emotional recovery through guided mindfulness and Reiki. And if you'd like to know more, please go to lovefraud.com/talk to Donna. There's a link in the description below this video. I also want to make sure that you know about the True LOVEFRAUD Stories podcast. In this series, I interview people about their experiences with sociopaths, and then I talk to experts on some of the topics that come up during their stories. You can listen to the podcast wherever you get your podcast, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, whatever, and also on YouTube and YouTube Music, or at our website, lovefraud.com/podcast. So please subscribe to LOVEFRAUD Live. When you subscribe, you'll automatically be notified about all my new videos. And plus, by subscribing, you help boost the distribution, so you'll spread the word about the dangerous sociopaths who live among us. So now, we got some comments here. I'll answer your questions. Liz Johnson says, "Hi, Ms. Donna." Hi, Liz. Good to see you. Okay, so comorbidity. All right. These disorders can absolutely have comorbid situations. Now, what I described was not comorbidity when I was talking about the different ways that I describe sociopaths, meaning that sociopaths is an umbrella term for antisocial, narcissistic, borderline, and histrionic personality disorders. They're all distinct disorders when you look at the diagnostic criteria, but there is an awful lot of overlap over these disorders. And for that reason, that's the reason that I want to use the term sociopath to encompass all of them. Because for you and me who are in these situations, we really don't need to know precisely what the diagnosis is. Now, if I were a therapist trying to treat someone, or, a lawyer going to court and trying to decide if somebody's engaged in criminal behavior or something like that, in those situations, yes, you do need to know a precise diagnosis, especially if you're trying to treat somebody. But for the garden variety abuse that the rest of us put up with or endure, it doesn't really matter what the diagnosis is, if it's antisocial personality disorder or narcissist, and they all engage in similar behavior. The most common behavior is the fact that they exploit and manipulate other people. So for that reason, I use the term sociopath to cover all of them. So we could just talk about them because they all engage in very similar behavior. Now, there are other comorbidities that can happen. For example, the research that my colleague Dr. Leanne Leadham and I did indicated that there is often an overlap or comorbidity between psychopathy and bipolar disorder. In fact, she estimates that about 10% of people diagnosed as psychopathy can also have bipolar disorder. So that can happen. And then another situation is when people have both psychopathy and schizophrenia. And this is like the worst of the worst. They call those folks schizopaths. And the reason that it's bad is because schizophrenic are delusional. Psychopaths are not normally delusional, except, in their feelings that they're the best, most important people in the world. But, they're not hearing voices. They're not seeing hallucinations or anything like that. But when you combine people who have schizophrenia with people who have psychopathy, a schizopath, then you have someone who could be hearing voices and seeing illusions, and also has no conscience. So this is a really serious comorbidity that doesn't happen very often, but when it does, it's pretty messy. Okay, so Butterfly Season says, "What's the best way to start your healing after the betrayal?" The best thing to do, there's two things. It's kind of a multi-step process. The first thing you probably want to do is to educate yourself about the personality disorder. And the reason for that is, first of all, to figure out what happened and why this person did what they did. But it's very important for everybody who's been in these situations to understand that it's not your fault. Okay, whatever went on is not your fault. The person, the sociopath, will tell you that whatever went on was your fault, but it isn't. And here's the key thing. Nothing you could have ever done would have made this person treat you any better. Okay. I mean, a lot of people, have reclamations where they say, oh, if I had only done this, if I had only done that, it would have worked out. No, 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 no. There is nothing you could have done that will make this person treat you any better. So that's the first step. The first step is to understand on an intellectual level, what you were dealing with and how it affected you. The second part, in my opinion, is to allow yourself to actually experience the pain of what has gone on. And this is something that many of us don't do. I mean, we don't know how to do it. Because, who wants to sit around and experience pain? But the thing is that, it gets built up inside of us. And if we don't allow ourselves to experience it, we're kind of denying ourselves. We're saying that, our feelings aren't worth or aren't appropriate. And the fact of the matter is that emotions are always appropriate. Now, you can't control what you feel. Now, what you do with the emotions, that's a different story. But whatever emotions you are feeling are appropriate, because that's what you feel. And what emotions are internal warnings of, something that you need in your awareness. So, whatever you're feeling is appropriate. Now, there may be, you may not want to, express your emotions when you're at work or something like that. Or, you need to be in a place where you can do it, preferably privately. But, you do want to allow yourself to do that. And at the same time, you also want to be good to yourself. You've been through a lot. If you've been betrayed by a sociopath, you've been through a lot. So anything that you can do to be good to yourself, to bring a little bit of happiness into your life, that's important as well. So I guess I talked about three things. The first thing is to educate yourself. The second thing is to allow yourself to feel the emotions that you experienced. This is something that I help people with, and you kind of just have to let them come up. And the thing about emotions is that they always end. Sometimes we're afraid to do it because we feel like, oh my goodness, if I let myself start to cry, I'll never stop. Well, that's not really true. Yeah, you can cry for a while, but it'll stop. And, once you let it out, then you feel a lot better. So anyway, that's the first two. And then the third part is to be good to yourself in any way that you can. Okay. How much is your help? Okay, well, if you want to take a look, go to lovefraud.com/talk to Donna. And I could talk to you for half an hour. It's amazing how much gets done in a half an hour. I could talk to you in an hour. I could talk to you for an hour and a half. If you want to talk, multiple times, that's fine. I'm very easy, So I invite you to go to lovefraud.com and see. I've got lots of good customer reviews, so please check it out. And I don't necessarily want to say a price because this video will be up forever, but I will say that it's very reasonable. So anyway, but check it out and you'll be able to see. Okay, good evening. Hey y'all. Okay, so Chef Walters says, is there any way to get the sociopath or covert narcissist to leave before they destroy what is left of the family? That's like a really difficult question to answer. I can't really answer that in a vacuum. You kind of need to know what the circumstances are, and you have to know the traits of the person that you're dealing with, because although sociopaths have a lot in common, they're all different and they all have different objectives. Some of them, it might be easy to get them to go away, because they don't really care. The fact of the matter is that sociopaths do not have the ability to authentically love. So therefore, they don't really love you. They don't really love the kids. They don't really love the dog, anything like that. So sometimes they just disappear. Other times they view the family as their property and they don't want to give up their property. They also, some of them are vindictive in that they want to, maybe boss the kids around or in order to hurt you or something like that. So that's certainly, if you wanted to talk, that's certainly the situation, and share, what your experience is and what you're going through. We could certainly talk about that, but it's kind of hard to answer without knowing more of what goes on. And the other thing that I will say about that is that you often need to be really strategic in figuring out how you're going to deal with the situation. And that's why it's so important to educate yourself, because you have to, understand what they're up to and what they're doing, and then recognize that they're heartless, and try and figure out what your motivation is, or their motivation is. So, there's an awful lot of strategy involved in figuring out how to get the person out. I mean, often, or usually in these situations, what the sociopath essentially wants is to win. Now, what winning means, you don't know. That changes, depending on the person and what their objectives are. But sometimes if you can figure out a way that will make them think that they won, but you got what you really wanted, that's another way to approach it. So again, there's a million different ways to address any particular situation, and it kind of depends on what you're dealing with. Okay. All right. Well then, I also, if anybody has any more questions, please feel free to ask. But in the meantime, I thought that I might want to elaborate on a couple of things. Some of you, after listening to this presentation today about, sociopaths burning out and why they don't burn out, you might wonder, why did mental health professionals think that they burned out to begin with? And the reason for that is because that, especially when they're doing research on antisocial personality disorder, most of the research was done with prisoners, either prisoners or college students. And most of the data going way back, I mean, one of the ways that they measured the disorder is through criminal statistics, measurements of crime. And people have known for 100 years, more than 100 years, that criminal behavior tends to peak when people are like in their early 20s and then go down after that. And so because criminal behavior would peak in their early 20s and then go down, the assumption was made that the personality disorder also peaked in 20s and went down. And that's not necessarily the case. But it also gets into the difference between antisocial personality disorder and psychopathy, because antisocial personality disorder is essentially almost totally about criminal behavior, and they have a few other things in there. Whereas psychopathy also includes personality traits. And what I mean by that is, when they're evaluating somebody. So like some of the psychopathic personality traits include glibness and being grandiose and a lack of guilt. Well, none of those things necessarily mean that it's criminal behavior, but those are definitely parts of psychopathy. So essentially what happens is that there are two facets of psychopathy, and one is about all these internal traits like glibness and charisma and lack of empathy, and the other is about the behavior. So the criminal behavior does decrease, but the personality traits do not. And so what happens is that people may engage in, those who are psychopathic with a criminal bent may figure out how to stay out of jail. So they engage in less antisocial behavior, although my research found that they were still engaging in antisocial behavior and criminality, just not getting caught. So that's what's going on there. But anyway, so that's the basic idea. Originally, that, because criminal behavior went down, they assumed that antisocial personality disorder went down, and that's not how it works. So anyway, let's see if we have any more questions. Okay. Jazz and Laughter says, are sociopaths mentally disordered, or do they have a character disorder? It gets confusing as to what it is. Yeah, and this is exactly why I often use the term sociopath to describe all of it, is because, they have all these little slices and it's confusing. A character disorder and a personality disorder are essentially the same thing. Now, this is not the same as mental illness. Now, the difference is that people who have mental illness, like, for example, anxiety or PTSD, previously they were healthy, and then something happened to make them sick. So, previously they were reasonably functioning or okay, and then something comes along, and for some reason they became anxious, they became depressed, they have PTSD. So that's what an illness is. There was a state of health, and then this state of health has changed, and now the person is sick. So that's a mental illness. Now, with a personality disorder or a character disturbance, they're pretty much synonymous. What it is what this person is. These are deep-seated traits that aren't going to change, and that's the whole point of the senior sociopath findings in the book, is that they don't change. They don't get better. So that's what the difference is. These are deep inborn traits that are not going to change, and that's what a personality disorder is. So that's the distinction between an illness and a disorder. And again, to emphasize, that's why it's so important that if you figure out you're dealing with somebody who's a senior or any sociopath, I know people, I've spoken to them who've been in these involvements for 20 and 30 and 40 years and just hoping and praying for change, waiting to, once the kids are gone, once we're retired, it'll get better. It doesn't get better. So, don't be waiting for that, and make your life plans accordingly. Understand that this person is not going to get better, if you hang in there, into old age. And then, and this has happened quite a few times, what if you're in a situation where you need care and you've got this heartless psychopath as a partner who doesn't care? That's a pretty bad situation. So that's why it's important to understand that they do not get better. Okay, so we have Chef Walters here. Does a normal person have some of these traits? And the answer is yes, but not nearly to the degree that a psychopath has. And I can tell you a little bit about that. The way psychopathy is measured is that there's something called the Psychopathy Checklist Revised. And what it is a list of 20 traits and behaviors. And if someone is doing an evaluation, they look at each one of these traits and behaviors, and they say, does this person have this trait? Not at all. Like, for example, grandiosity. Are they grandiose? Not at all, a little bit, or a lot. Essentially, it's a 0, 1, and 2. So they go through each of these 20 traits, and each trait has either 0, 1, or 2. So that means that someone who's being evaluated can be on a continuum, a score that ranges from 0 to 40. 40 is the top of the line. And typically, and this is kind of a rule of thumb, anybody who scores 30 to 40 is considered to be a psychopath. They're bad. But people who score 10 and people who score 20, they're also not people that you want to hang around with, because they've got some of these traits. So to answer your question, a normal person typically scores maybe 4, and a psychopath will score 40. So that's what it is. But all these disorders, yes, they are on a continuum with normal, which means that you might have some of these traits, but not nearly to the extent and degree that a psychopath does. Okay. Well, that looks like all the questions that we have for tonight. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. I'm so glad that you were here. And next week, we'll be back on the Tuesday schedule. I had to change it to Wednesday this week, but next week, we'll be here on Tuesday. So I invite you to join me again next week, Tuesday at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. See you later. Bye-bye. Okay.